الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم لك الحمد على ما أنعمت علينا من نعم لا تحصى يا أكرم الأكرمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Imam Birgivi's Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya, we've completed the section on the fundamental virtues related to the heart and how one acquires taqwa of the heart, right? By ridding oneself of the key blameworthy qualities. And then he looked at some of the key praiseworthy qualities that a believer should strive to acquire that are not related to what we looked at of the blameworthy qualities. Some of the comprehensive praiseworthy qualities. And the most important of these were uprightness and being true, having insight and reflection amongst others. And we detailed those. Then he listed all the virtues mentioned so far in a discursive list. So then Imam al-Birgivi mentioned something that is of significance. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, قال الإمام البرغوي رحمه الله تعالى وللمتقدمين ومن سلك مسلكهم في ضبط الفضائل وحدودها طريقة لا بأس أن نذكرها. The early scholars and those who followed their method, meaning of the later scholars, have a way, a method with respect to mentioning the virtues and the definitions of these virtues that there's no harm in mentioning. Now, the word here, la ba's, there's no harm. Usually, la ba's in classical Arabic is used, there's no harm in it. Frequently, it refers to something, there's no harm in this, meaning, but it is not optimal. But words have meanings that arise out of context as well. So la ba's, the word la ba's, there's nothing wrong with it, can frequently in classical Arabic mean that something else is better, number one. Sometimes it can mean, so that's a usual meaning in formal language. But it can also mean there's nothing whatsoever wrong with it, meaning it's permissible. So the opposite of nothing wrong with it can be what's improper. It's allowed, but it's not the right thing. It's improper or suboptimal, right? ما خلافه أولى. The contrary of it is superior. But sometimes it can be that this should be, there is nothing wrong with it, rather it is good. It can even sometimes refer to there's nothing wrong with it, but rather it's necessary. Right? And that's the nuance of language. There's nothing wrong, meaning it's not wrong, but it's not good. Or there's nothing wrong at all, or there's nothing wrong and it's good. And in some cases, can even be there's nothing wrong, rather it is necessary. And that's the nuance of language, right? The nuance of language. And and you see many examples of this kind of nuanced usage in the Quran, right? Because that's the nature of the most powerful human language, Arabic, that there's nuance, right? Which is why we need to think, right? And we need to consider context. So he says, here what's meant by the early scholars, right, the mutaqaddimin, it's either referring to the philosophers, the pre-Islamic philosophers, and most particularly the Greeks, right? Aristotle and others, right? Aristotle, Plato, others, they talked about ethics and they classified ethics in particular ways. And it was a good expression. And some of the early Muslim scholars found that classification beneficial. Now, some people say, look, these rationalist scholars, they take, no, right? Reason, like logically, sound reason and revelation would accord with each other. Because revelation, sound reason is a means to what? To truth, to that which is true. Correct? Sound reason. And revelation is truth, right? So if someone reasons something out, right, it may lead them to the truth if the reasoning was sound, right? And just because something was deduced by reason does not mean it's wrong. Rather, sound reason should come to a sound conclusion. Allah has given us intellects to reason. So just the fact that this was something that, let's say, the Greeks, for example, and others came up, and if you actually look at how other civilizations far away from the Greeks, if you look at how the ancient Indians, right, they talked about virtues, how the Chinese talked about virtues. The terminology, the system may be different, but the fundamental virtues are broadly the same. How you classify them, there's some distinctions. And then he says, وَإِنْ وَقَعَ التِّكْرَارُ فِي بَعْض, even if there's repetition with some, with what he has mentioned before. لِعَدَمِ خُلُوِّهَا عَنِ الْفَائِدَةِ, because this classification is not bereft of benefit. Rather, it is beneficial. Right? And what does this classification do? He says, وهي حصر أصولها وتفريع شعب كل منها عليه. So this method, what it does is it defines what are the foundational virtues. Right? The asl is the foundation, what you build other things upon, or the essence of something, right? The roots of something. So that there are essential foundational virtues, which we often in English, they refer to them as cardinal virtues. And all the branches of virtues come out from that. And he talked about this at the beginning of the section on taqwa as well, right? But in the sense that there are principal faculties within the human spirit, within the human heart, within the human self, the subtlety that makes you human. There's different capacities. So that's why he says, وَقَدْ عَلِمْتَ أَنَّ أُصُولَهَا أَرْبَعَةً. You know, you have come to know, meaning at the beginning of the section on the taqwa of the heart, that the foundational virtues are four. ثلاثة مفردة, three that are singular. وهي الحكمة والشجاعة والعفة. Right? And these can be translated in various ways, but to give, not to encumber us with others' baggage, right? The three singular virtues, and they are wisdom, courage, and restraint, right? And that's not how they're typically expressed in English, but we're not interested in Christian virtues right now. If you want a translation in that way, you can look at it there. So there's wisdom, courage, and dignified restraint. وواحد منها مركب من مجموع هذه الثلاثة. And there's a fourth virtue that is a composite of these three virtues. وهي العدالة. And that is justice or right balance. Right? It's right balance. So these are the four essential virtues, right? The first, right, is wisdom, right? Wisdom. And they define wisdom as the capacity, right, of the self to understand what is correct in a manner that distinguishes it from error. Okay, so wisdom is a capacity of the self to comprehend what is correct in a manner that distinguishes it from error. But wisdom has the sense of not just seeing things as they are, but judging things in a manner that enables you to make a sound judgment, not a wrong judgment, right? So for example, the difference between knowing something and wisdom is that, someone says, he is a man. So Zubaydah says, he is a man. I can marry him. So she says, will you marry me? To some random stranger. Is that likely going to have a right outcome? No, of course not. But was each of the statements on itself true? So that's the difference between knowledge and wisdom, right? That wisdom has a sense not only of knowing things correctly, but coming to sound judgments with respect to their outcomes. And we'll see what are the aspects of wisdom, right? But wisdom has this sense of, it's a capacity to make sound judgments that are not in error. The second virtue is courage, which is a capacity within the self, that leads one to direct oneself to things that you should direct yourself to. That's courage. The capacity within the self to direct oneself to the things that one knows that one must direct oneself to. Right? So for example, you attend a musalla where they give terrible khutbahs and the khatib is not there. You're like, oh well, if no one comes, I'll look for a late jama'ah. Courage is a capacity within self to direct yourself to the things that you know that you should direct yourself to. Right? And we'll see what are the branches of each of these. Right? The third is restraint. Iffa. Right? Right? Dignified restraint. And the ulama define dignified restraint, and it's restraint with dignity, right? It's a capacity by which one pursues matters that are desired or sought in accordance with revelation and propriety, right? Right? So restraint is a capacity within oneself by which you pursue things that are desired or sought in accordance with the Sharia, with revelation, the Sharia, divine guidance, and propriety, right? So someone says, I have to have a burger, right? Dignified restraint would entail first, you make sure you choose a place that is halal, that's free of doubtful matters, but then you pursue the eating of the thing in a dignified way. And you run in and say, manager, I need a steak right now. Okay, that's a ribeye. Send another one I need to have it. I'll give you $200. And you take it, you're still not standing. You grab the steak and start chewing it. Right? It was halal for you to eat that. They agreed to let you take the steak. But is that dignified? No, and that's one of the foundational virtues. Right? Now there's of course more subtle matters, right? That you pursue things within the limits of the Sharia, both the obligatory limits and the recommended limits. They do it within that you make sure it's halal. Secondly, make sure it's accordance with the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Number three, that it is in an appropriate manner. Right? So in some societies, there's nothing wrong with making sounds while you're eating. Actually, in some cultures, if you don't slurp the soup, it's like you didn't like it. But is that proper manners here? Is it? You have the soup go. No. Right? You did that if you're having noodles and stuff in certain cultures, that's fine. There's no intrinsic dislike in that in the Sharia. What is proper in different places? Right? So that is dignified restraint. You're starving. Is it haram for you to eat with both hands and keep stuffing your face? No. But is it in accordance with the sunnah? No. The sunnah is that you take a small bite, put it in your mouth, don't stretch your hand until you take the second one. They're the sunnahs of eating. Also dignified eating. Okay? That you're eating, do you put your arms on the table, etc.? So that's what social dignity is. Okay. So we have wisdom, courage, restraint, and number 4 is one that encompasses all three, which is justice. Adala. Because what is justice? Right? He says, right, that justice, right, the commentator, Imam al-Khadimi says, justice is a capacity of the human self that causes one to fulfill commands and avoid prohibitions, and to characterize yourself with what is befitting for the like of you. Right? So being just, justice is right balance. Right? Right balance is a capacity within oneself to be just, that you fulfill the command, avoid prohibitions, and characterize yourself with the qualities befitting your context. Right? That's to be just. Because justice is right balance. And the ulama, and this is one of the things that intrigued them, because justice, the Prophet ﷺ said, "A'ti kulla dhi haqqin haqqa." Give all who have a right their due right. So it's a right balance of wisdom. You consider, you judge right, and consider consequences. Wisdom. But you also have the courage that you know that this is what you need to do, so you do it. Right? Whether it relates to the rights of Allah or the rights of people. And you have dignified restraint. Right? So justice, which is understood to be right balance, arises by having wisdom to know the right thing and how to pursue it, the courage to actively pursue it, and the restraint that in the pursuit you don't do what is wrong or undignified. Right? So that's why they said that justice or right balance is a combination of these. Now, Imam al-Khadimi in his commentary on the Tariqah al-Muhammadiyah defines these virtues in a deeply Islamic sense. And there are great works related to ethics. They found that the classification, and this classification is largely based, if you studied some philosophy, and one of the branches of philosophy is ethics, right? And they look at the different works of ethics of the Greek tradition. You'll see many similarities, but so it's a useful framework. So much so that some of the Islamic philosophers even argued that maybe was Plato a prophet? We have no proof of anything like that. That's pure speculation. But is this, does this capture virtue in a compelling manner? Yes. But they saw that if you look at each of these virtues, these essential virtues, right? What is a simple Islamic case for each of these 4 virtues? Firstly, wisdom. and wisdom. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam his sunnah is referred to in the Quran as being wisdom. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ لَقَدْ مَنَّ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Allah has indeed bestowed great favor upon the believers when He sent to them a messenger from amongst themselves, reciting to them Allah's book, teaching them Allah's book. يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ, reciting to them Allah's book, وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ, and purifying them, وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ, and He teaches them the book and the wisdom. What is the wisdom? It's the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The sunnah of the Prophet. The sunnah in multiple places in the Quran has been referred to as wisdom. Right? So the straight path is the path of wisdom. As-sirat al-mustaqim is the path of wisdom. Because what is the straight path? The straight path in reality is not an abstract path that you're looking for in life. The straight path is the direct way to the pleasure of Allah. Whether the minimum pleasure of Allah of acceptability, or what is pleasing to Allah, or what is beloved to Allah. But the straight path is the direct route to the divine, to the pleasure of Allah, from where you are, right? To Allah, right? To either what's acceptable to Allah, pleasing to Allah, or beloved to Allah. That's the straight path. And to be able to know in which direction is Allah's pleasure requires wisdom. So the straight path is wisdom, or it requires wisdom. But then that straight path requires pursuit, because the straight path is challenging. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the straight path in the Quran, in Surah Al-Balad. فَلَقْتَحَمَ الْعَقَبَةِ, if only they had the courage to pursue the high way. Right? The aqaba is the high way. Right? The high way. Why is the high way? Because it requires iqtiham. It requires courage to pursue. Right? That's shaja'a. Why? Because the high way, which is the way of making the struggle to make the choices beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, requires sacrifice. It requires struggle. فَلَقْتَحَمَ الْعَقَبَةِ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةِ, and what do you know? What is the high way? فَكُّ رَقَبَةِ, it is to free a slave. أَوْ إِطْعَامٌ فِي يَوْمٍ ذِي مَسْغَبَةِ, right? Or to feed when you don't have much, right? Those in need, etc. The rest of the verses. وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا, and those who strive for our sake. لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا, it is those that we shall truly guide to our ways. Right? Striving requires courage. Right? So this is also central to the Quranic call to virtue. Wisdom, courage, likewise, iffa, dignified restraint. Adab, all of proper manners is rightful restraint. It's rightful restraint. And the Prophet ﷺ, one of his most frequent du'as was, Allahumma inni as'aluka al-huda, wal-tuqa, wal-afafa, wal-ghina. Oh Allah, I ask you for all guidance, and all mindfulness, and all dignified restraint, al-afaf, and all freedom of need from all besides you, al-ghina. Right? And likewise, justice. Justice. The Prophet ﷺ said, أَعْطِ كُلَّ ذِي حَقٍّ حَقَّهُ, give all who have a right their due right. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانِ, and Allah has placed the right balance in all things in creation. Right? So saying that these virtues have nothing to do with Islam has nothing to do with understanding. It's folly. And inshallah, in the fall term here at Seekers Canada, we'll be looking at one of the great works on ethics, which is, what's it called? The Akhlaq of Imam Aduddin al-Iji. Imam Iji's treatise on ethics or on character. Right? But akhlaq can refer to character, can refer to ethics, or to right conduct or virtue. Okay, so he says, فَشُعَبُ الْحِكْمَةِ, right? So the branches of wisdom, right, are 7, right? The branches of wisdom are 7. And he puts as, in some copies, it has a za, which refers to the number 7. So what does the branches of wisdom are? Firstly, صفاء الذهن, having a clear mind, right? Which is استعداد النفس لاستخراج المطلوب بلا تشويش. Having a clear mind is a capacity within the self to come to sound conclusions, without tashwish, without being confused, right? Without being confused. And this is all, of course, we're not just looking at it that if you want to be wise, you have to have a clear mind. And one of the key things that a clear mind requires is to get rid of mental chatter, whether it be misgivings, waswasa, following doubts and so on. Also, of the things that cloud the mind is emotions. People don't make sound decisions because they make emotional decisions, right? Similarly, people make unsound decisions because they are influenced by what people say, right? They're influenced by what people say, right? And if they were to think about it, it's such a foolish choice. I know somebody who wouldn't go to, like he lives next to some of the people working in his company and said, they're up at Fajr time. If I walk to the masjid, what will they say? You can walk to the masjid, and if you think, okay, what's the reward of walking to the masjid? Whoa. And what will they say? Will they fire you? Said, no, they're trying to get me to join the management team, but I don't want the responsibility because I'm comfortable where I am. Why would they fire you for walking to the masjid? Do you declare when you walk to the masjid, I am going to the masjid? Do you do bhangra, saying walking to the masjid? No, right? You're just walking. They're up as well. They're probably exercising or doing whatever. You're walking, right? Right? So the branches of wisdom, right? One is having a clear mind. But one of the key things for having a clear mind is to think, okay, what are the things that cloud my judgment? And to get rid of them. That's why, and one of the things that cloud our judgment now are advertising, distractions. Right? The Prophet ﷺ is described in the Shama'il, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا خرج من بيته غض طرفه إلا عما يعنيه. The Prophet ﷺ, if he left home, would lower his gaze from anything that was not of concern to him. People were of concern to him. He would greet even children before they greeted him. But anything that was not of concern, he would just keep his gaze lowered. Right? People do the wackiest things. So I was watching this show on an antique dealership in Texas. Why are you watching a show on that? Oh, it just came up on my Facebook feed. Right? So a lot of things cloud our mind. Right? Cloud our mind. From the Prophet ﷺ said, "Min husn Islam al-mar'i," from the excellence of a person's Islam, is to leave all that does not concern them. There's a lot of things that don't concern you. Everything that is not of concern to you, that's not of concern to you, is not of concern to you. by definition. What is of concern to you? What is of concern to you is that which is good for you in your akhirah or good for you in your dunya, in a manner that leads to the good of the akhirah. That's what's of concern to you. That which leads to رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً, O Lord, grant us the good of this life, which is the things that you seek in this life that are means to the pleasure of Allah. That's the good of this life. وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنًا, good in the next life. That's having a clear mind. Much of what you need for a clear mind is to rid yourself of all this tashwish, of the things you need to know in our times, like in other times, is all the ways of false influence that individuals and corporations exert against you. And you need to understand that people are using all kinds of, psychology of influence on you, direct and indirect, perceivable and imperceivable. So you need to take that very seriously, right? Why? Because it occludes your judgment. You are making choices, but you are being chosen in ways, right? Like games. We need to know that for our own children. Computer games are designed to be ultra addictive, right? They're designed to be addictive. There's a lot of psychology behind it. If you don't know, right? If you don't if you don't know, then you're not going to have a clear mind. Your children are going to be fools. Why? Because they're not able to make right choices. Computer games, right? And other things, right? Even TV shows. People watch TV shows and you can see the stats on it. People watch Netflix series or this series or that, and they don't like it. They complain on social media about it, but they go through it. Why? Because it is addictive. It is designed to rope you in. People upgrade devices that they don't like in the first place. They didn't need the first one, but they upgraded to the next one. They didn't like the first, they didn't like the second. Why? Because it's made to be addictive. We make our consumer choices totally swayed by things that are completely ridiculous. So don't watch advertising. Don't watch advertising. Don't care what other than Allah have to say. Unless their opinions, unless consideration of their opinions is related to the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And be aware that others are trying to sway you in ways that you're not to be swayed. And that's always been the case. The marketplace has always been the marketplace. If you think that modern corporations have manipulative practices, just go to a traditional marketplace. Have you been to a traditional marketplace? Go to a traditional marketplace. If you don't think they understand the psychology of influence, you have no clue. Have you been to a traditional marketplace? Go anywhere, right? And try to buy something. You'll end up buying 25 things if you're not careful. Right? I was just waiting for my son to come out of the mosque in one of the old parts of Istanbul. I think maybe I'll pick up some things for family. I ended up spending time that I bought stuff for much of the family. They chatted me up, this nice, gave me tea, ended up buying a whole bunch of things that I don't really care about, including not one, but 2 coffee makers. Right? This has always been the case. It's nothing new. It's old wine in new bottles. Right? But don't drink someone else's drink. Right? So having a clear mind also requires knowing the tools of sound thinking. Right? Knowing the tools of sound thinking. That's why. And Shaykh Hamza Yusuf, may Allah bless and protect and preserve him, always emphasizes, right, that to be an educated person has always meant knowing grammar, logic, and rhetoric. You have to have the capacity to express yourself soundly, to think soundly, right? Grammar, to understand soundly, to reason soundly, to express yourself soundly, right? And those are very important tools, right? Right? To be. And they're, but again, not just for utilitarian purpose. Right? That, okay, I need to learn copywriting to market my products. Well, yeah, if you learn some copywriting, but there's underlying principles of sound understanding, of sound reasoning, of sound expression. Right? And it's far more powerful than any gimmicky copywriting blog or something. Right? So that's clear thinking. Related to, or purity of mind. Right? Secondly, jawdatul fahm is having strong understanding, which is sihhatul intiqal min al malzoom ila al lazim. Strong understanding is being able to soundly go from a matter to what it entails. Right? So you can think things through. Right? Clearly. Because words convey meanings. Like if you say a matter, there's meanings it contains within, and there's meanings that it entails. And you need to be able to think that through. Right? Just that, let's say you have a guest, and they say, SubhanAllah, I was traveling for 10 hours. What do you understand from that? Yeah, so they only said I was traveling for 10 hours. But it entails that they're tired. They may be hungry. It also probably entails things from you that don't keep them up longer. Right? That's a simple case. But that applies to many other things as well. Right? So wisdom entails being able to understand the implications of things. Right? Thirdly, al-dhaka, right, is having a sharp mind. Right? So strong understanding, but also sharp mind. Right? Dhaka, to be smart, which is being able to quickly, sur'atu iqtirah al-nata'ij, is to quickly get to conclusions. Right? To quickly get to conclusions. That you're able to reason, you have a sharp mind, but you can get to the conclusions of things. Right? Right? And they use an example of that. Right? That there's a steward or servant of a king. He's traveling with the king, they stopped at the edge of a hill. And the king was looking up in the distance. The steward told the king to rest. Right? And told the other people, just get the king to rest. Came back in 3 hours with a bowl of snow. Because the king was headed in a different route, but he was longing for the mountains. That's dhaka, being smart. That you can quickly reach the conclusions of things. Like yesterday, I was so happy I was teaching a class in Aqidah, and I mentioned something about what is the nature of the proof of the claim of prophethood. Right? And there's 3 positions. Immediately, one of the students said it would be very hard to argue that it is number 2. And the second student said some really smart things related. I was like, he said, that's smart. You mentioned something, people can see the conclusion very clearly. Right? But that requires 1 and 2. Keeping your mind clear and having strong understanding. Because if you keep your mind clear, right, unpolluted, cultivate sound understanding, then you'll be able to you cultivate being smart. To be able to come to sound conclusions. That requires, number 4, husn al-tasawwur, to soundly conceive of things. Right? which is البحث عن الأشياء بقدر ما هي عليه, which is to investigate matters in accordance with how they are. Right? Right? Why? Because very often people are at enmity to things that they don't understand. To soundly conceive of things. So I remember there's once I was at a rihla program and had to teach Hanafi fiqh. And Imam Zayd said, look, I've sent this student to your class. He's just come out of prison. And he's a bit of a literalist. And he used to be a troublemaker in prison. I said, why was he in prison? He said he probably did someone in. I said, thank you for sending him to me. He said, no, he's a good guy. I said, what do you advise? He's going to ask you lots of questions. He's going to ask, what's the basis of this in the Quran and the Sunnah? So I said, what should I do? I said, explain it. So what I would do, right? Because he'd object to anything. So I talked to him before one of the classes. Everything I'd say, he'd have an objection. So every time I just say, the Hanafis looked at the Quran and Sunnah, and what they concluded was such and such. Then he came up and said, Shaykh, I'm going to become Hanafi like you. I said, why? I said, because everything's based on the Quran and Sunnah. I didn't even mention a single proof. I decided I'm not going to mention a single proof. I just said, the Hanafis look at the Quran and Sunnah, and this is what they concluded. They're like, great. Right? So often people are at enmity to something. Why? Because they don't understand what it is. Right? So before you make a judgment, you have to understand something correctly. Right? And very often people misjudge things because they don't know what it is. So they're not able to act in a wise manner. Right? A lot of people, for example, in our communities are scared of learning. Because, it'll complicate my religion. Does learning make things more difficult? No, it actually makes things much easier. Because without knowledge, someone's trying to be religious without learning, they tend to make things a lot more difficult for themselves. Right? Right? Because why? Because they don't have a sound conception of what knowledge is. Right? So you have a clear mind, sharp understanding, being smart. Number 4 is to soundly conceive of things. Right? Because before you accept something, you have to know what it is. Then you can judge yes or no. Right? Okay. And even if you use a simple example, right? Some people say that, Mexican mangoes are terrible. Why do you say Mexican mangoes are terrible? I had it once. Now, can you make a sound judgment about all Mexican mangoes on the basis of eating them once? And there's khilaf, right? Have you ever had good Mexican mangoes? Okay, there's khilaf about Mexican mangoes, but, that's not a sound judgment. Say Mexican mangoes are terrible, maybe bad business, right? Like if you're considering starting a line of Mexican mangoes, say, I'm not going to buy Mexican mangoes for my business. You started like a fruit delivery service. Because unbeknownst to you, you ate the mangoes 10 years ago. Since then, there's really high-end Mexican mangoes that are really good. There's a market for it. So you end up harming your business by making a decision that's not based on sound understanding. I heard that Jamaican mangoes are no good, but they may be actually really good. Right? So a lot of times we make judgments in life that don't have good outcomes. Why? Because we haven't soundly conceived of the matter, which needs, you have to pause, think about it. Do I understand it correctly? Yes. Then you make your judgment. Right? That's part of wisdom. So that was number 4. Number 5, suhulatu ta'allum. Ease of learning. Right? Ease of learning. right? Ease of learning, which he defines as قوة النفس على درك المطلوب بلا زيادة سعي, right? Now, ease of learning or being quick to learn, right? Which is a capacity within the self to understand what is sought without excessive effort, right? Now, this is, for some people, it's a natural capacity, but you can cultivate it, typically. Not always, but typically. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi mentions in a wonderful work of his called Al-Faqih wal-Mutafaqih that a man came to one of the early scholars and said, Lam afham, I didn't understand. So the scholar said to him, لو أنك ما فهمت لأنك لم تفهم فأفهمك. Said, if you didn't understand because it's, let's say, sorry, he said, if you don't understand because you didn't quite understand, then I will explain it to you. لكنك لو لم تفهم لأنك لن تفهم فدعني. Says, but if you didn't understand because you cannot understand, then please leave me alone. Right? But in most cases, each of these, whether it be a clear mind, sharp understanding, being smart, conceive of things clearly, or being easy to learn, can also be acquired. How? By effort. One is willingness, keenness, right? Keenness. Some of the best teachers we have at Seekers over the years started off very weak in many of their professional skills, right? Their English was weak, but they're very keen to improve their English. Within 4 months, 6 months, they're making almost no errors because they took the means. Why? Because some people learn quickly, but others they're keen to acquire the tools of learning, right? So they have the keenness and they learn, right? One of the dumbest students I ever taught has become one of the smartest students I've ever taught. I follow him on his Telegram channel now. He's on the National Fatwa Council of one of the Arab countries. Very sharp guy, very insightful, right? He used to come to class. Sometimes I wanted to like get up and just bang my head against the wall. Who didn't understand a thing, but would stick with it, would stick with it. And mashallah now, he walks around with 2 phones, right? His personal phone and the phone from the Fatwa Council. Because they've given a phone. So besides late at night and early in the morning, he's receiving phone calls all the time. He walks around Amman with a big turban. I always joke with him, how's the turban? Says, why? Because when he walks downhill, I said, be careful. When you walk downhill in Amman, your turban's so big, you may fall over. But there's societal, like, the muftis wear turbans, so they're clearly distinguished that this is a mufti in public, right? So people go ask them questions. But there has to be a willingness, right? Some people are just sharp. And very often the people who are slow to learn, but keen to learn and committed to learn, they become quick to learn. Whereas some of the people who struggle most in life, they're just naturally smart, but they become lazy. And they never acquire wisdom. Because each of these qualities, the clear mind, the sharp understanding, the smart, being smart, conceiving of things clearly, and being quick to learn, or ease of learning, all of them can be acquired. Every single one of these can be acquired. And that there's general agreement of the early scholars and the late scholars that all traits of character are of 2 types. They're innate and acquired. People are born with different capacities, but every human capacity is open to change, both for the better and for the worse. Both for the better, if cultivated, or for the worse, if corrupted. Right? The sixth element of wisdom is al-hifz, is memory, or literally memorizing, which is ضبط الصور المدركة, which is to retain, right, the forms of what you have understood, is to retain what you have understood. What is memory? Memory or memorization is to retain what you have understood, right? And of course, this is the part of the fall of modern man, and what what is from the elements of the decline of Western civilization, right? Right. What is described by Jacques Barzun as from dawn to decadence, right? You can say from dawn to decadence, then decay, right? Is loss of the emphasis on these key things. Amongst them is the importance of memorization. That understanding is enough. No, you need all the other things, right? And many of these in modern education, understanding matters, sharp understanding matters. But what are the tools of rigorous, sharp understanding? That's why you need grammar, you need logic properly, not just studying, but knowing it well. And these are qualities that we should cultivate in ourselves, but also in our children, right? In worldly matters, but also in religious matters. We shouldn't create religious fools, right? 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 Like Dr. Fuad Nahdi said, Allah wants fruitful believers, not a basket case of nuts, right? Right? But memory is very important, right? Like to be a person who knows, you need to know things too. You go to most lawyers, you ask them 10 questions about law, they don't know anything. What kind of lawyer are you? You don't know anything. Right? You go to any specialist, they don't know anything. Okay? You ask them about family law, say, oh, I do commercial law. You ask them about commercial law, say, no, I do only this type of commercial law. You ask them about that, say, oh, like, so what do you know? You spend all your life doing law, you don't even know the law. Right? Whereas an educated person should know. To be a person of knowledge means to know. Right? And that's a lifelong endeavor. It's not just to understand and then fake it. So memory is very important. And in the Islamic tradition, that's why we memorize Quran. Why? Because to be connected with the Quran, you must know it. It's with you wherever you may be. We memorize hadith. Not just to say, I've memorized X number of hadiths, but so when you're sitting, you can reflect on prophetic guidance. You can learn lessons from it. You can transmit it, right? But you have the tools of making sound decisions. وَالذِّكْر, and the seventh of the qualities of wisdom is dhikr, is recollection. Here it's not remembrance, it's recollection, which is istihdarul mahfuzat, which is that you can bring to mind what you have memorized. You can bring to mind what you have memorized. So these are the 7 elements of wisdom as part of, right? That if these are found together, right, which are that you have, firstly, you have a clear mind, right? And one of the keys to that is don't pollute your mind. And one of the ways they dumb us down is, we busy ourselves with events, but don't understand why they're happening. You're saying, oh, did you hear? They bombed this other city in Ukraine. Okay. And they did this and they did this. Okay. What's going on? Why is it happening? You have no clue. Right? So you've been following the news for days, but you have no idea why it's happening. That's just dumbing us down, what Chomsky calls manufacturing consent. That's basically what news does. It's a consumer good. You're buying news. Now you're buying it. What are you paying with? You're paying with your attention because you're consuming ads. Right? Your Gmail account isn't free. Right? What are you paying with? You're paying with a whole bunch of things. If you don't know, find out. Right? Facebook isn't free. Twitter isn't free. You're paying, you're the payment. Right? Your mind is what you're giving up. Right? Your rational autonomy is being given up. Right? Because your mind is no longer clear. You've allowed it to be polluted by a whole bunch of things. Sound understanding. Right? Which requires cultivating the tools of learning. Right? And there's great thing, like the works on Adabul Alim wal Muta'allim, the etiquette of the student and the learner. There's many important works on that by Imam Zarnuji. There's another work by Ibn Jama'ah. Both of these works are available through Firdaus books on the etiquette of the student and the learner. There's, these are things that there are ways you can cultivate the sound mind. To learn how to read in depth, right? And then to be smart, right? To be able to apply that, to actively apply that so you become good at thinking and reasoning. Fourth, to conceive of things soundly, which is make judgments only after having this relevant details soundly. Right? So you have a comprehensive understanding of something before you make the judgment. The relevant comprehensive understanding. Right? To have the suhula to ta'allum, to be quick to learn. Many people have an innate capacity, but you cultivate it. And anything that can be learned through taking the right means. The sixth is memorization, memory. As believers, we should know. Simple as that. Right? It's a bid'ah right from children. Our children should know details about the world, history, geography, all the things. So I want to just cultivate love of the Prophet ﷺ, but my kid doesn't know anything about the Prophet ﷺ. Well, we sing songs together. Well, you're raising a fool. Right? Because once you stop singing the song, one day they might think, or the shaitan might just put thoughts in their brain. Why do you believe in the Prophet Muhammad? They're like, I don't know. Right? And that with a few temptations, and the whole house of songs has burned down. Right? You just raised a fool. Right? And emotions are a very weak argument. So memory, we should know. Our children should know. And one of the ways to know is to read. One of the ways to know, right, and also not to have a polluted mind, that don't entertain your children. Don't entertain your children. Right? Let them be bored. Right? Because then they may actually sit down, calm down, read, think, and truly be human beings, rather than just being, young consumers. Right? Why are my kids hyperactive? Because you've hyperstimulated them. But how much time do they actually sit down and think? Not much. And one of the most annoying things about my father, Allah protect him in good health, so whenever I'd ask for a toy, he'd take me to buy books. If he was allowed to to jump on to go zombie on your parents, right? Like, what's wrong with you? I want a toy. He just take me to the bookstore and said, you can buy one book. Or more. I wanted to smash the glass, kick the books. Hey, go pick up some books. Okay. Right? I actually tried drama as well. 2.5 months, I would protest every time we'd leave home because I wanted a bike. Every time I'd say, okay, take me to a bookstore, you can buy a book. Once I threw myself in front of a toy shop. I want a bike. And just calmly, because I knew I couldn't just stay in front of the store because self-preservation. But you need that. Right? You need that. You have to let your kids get bored. Not bored in a bad way, that you have to engage in meaningful activities and all these things, but you overstimulate them in silly ways, you just raise fools, right? Let them think. Don't have others think for them. Right? Let them think. Let them reason. Let them read. Right? And they should know. Right? And have the capacity to apply that knowledge, right, that they've acquired, to recollect, a dhikr, to have sharp recollection. And these are some of the elements of wisdom. Next class, we're going to look at the 12 elements of courage and restraint. Right? The 12 elements of courage and restraint. Right? And this is a beautiful summary of the essential virtues. We wanted to just expand on these 7 elements of wisdom. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for steadfastness and uprightness and success. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Do you have any questions online? The spammers? Alhamdulillah. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen.